So good afternoon, everybody. I will start on the next chapter about the sources of demographic information. So far what we saw in the course was an introduction to demography, and then we went to the chapter about age and sex composition, which kind of summarizes changes in fertility, mortality, and migration. And then we went into give a general idea of demographic changes that are going on in the world. And then we went to the US. And then finally, we went to a more theoretical chapter about theories of demography. And we went into more detail about the demographic transition method, demographic transition model. We also discussed the theories of fertility, mortality, migration. And now this chapter is a quick chapter in which we will discuss what are places where we can collect data in order to do all those analyses that we have been talking throughout the semester so far. So the idea now is to try to understand what are the possible places that we can collect this information, and a lot of this information is available online. So it's public available information. And let's see here, good. And this chapter is gonna be subdivided in these three parts. I'm gonna explain you the national censuses, which is one of the three basic demographic data sources, registration systems, and then surveys. So, and I will give you like an emphasis on the US censuses, a little bit more here. Also explain a little bit more about the registration system in the US. And surveys, I will give you some examples of surveys that we have out there that collect information on demographic trends and levels across societies. So the national censuses, it's pretty much the collection of data about the whole population. So it's the total process of collecting, compiling, and publishing demographic, economic, and social data pertaining at a specific time to all persons in a country or in a specific territory. Whenever we use the word census, that means that we are getting information about the whole population. All right, so technically, our ultimate goal is to get information about 100% of the people living in a specific country at a specific time. And the main idea, the main purpose of censuses are to obtain data about the size, composition, and distribution of the population. So how big is the population? What are the characteristics of people in terms of age, sex, race, ethnicity, and a series of other characteristics, and where are these people located? Because people are not randomly located in all different portions of a country. They tend to be concentrated in specific areas of the country. What are some examples of demographic characteristics? We can collect information about how many children women have in total, whether women had a child in the last year prior to the census. We can collect information about mortality, whether specific households experienced mortality of some family members, of children, and so on. So we can collect this information. We can collect information about education enrollment and attainment of everybody in a specific household. Enrollment, asking if people are enrolled in school right now or not. And attainment, asking people which was the latest education degree that they completed. Was it high school, college, grad school, and so on. We can ask questions about whether people are employed or not. We can ask questions about their earnings, how much money are they making their main job, how much money are they making on all jobs that they are employed, how much money all members in the household are making in that specific time. And we can also ask information about health habits, about whether people have some sort of disability, whether people have health insurance. So all this information can be collected in censuses. And we also can collect information related to migration. So country of birth, where the person was born, whether the person is a citizen or not in the current country of residence, what are the languages that the people talk in that specific household, whether those people were living in another household 5 years ago and where was it, ethnic heritage. So all these different questions can be asked in censuses, and they vary between countries and they also vary across time, right? In censuses, they have been collected throughout history for centuries already. So the first censuses were recorded in the ancient Egypt, China, and Rome. And the 1700s. So here in the US, the first census was the 1790 census, and it counted a total of 3.9 million inhabitants. And it was a really simple census. It was really pretty much just counting people for specific categories of race and sex. So they differentiated free white males by whether they were over or under the age of 16 to determine physical and military obligations of citizens. They also collect information about how many women were in each one of the states and also of slaves. And in Spain, the first census was from 1787, and it counted 10.4 million people living in the Kingdom of Spain at that time. And by the 2010 census round, what does it mean, 2010 census round? Censuses that were completed between 2005 and 2014, more than 230 countries collected data by the end of the 2010 census round. So that it's pretty much estimated to be around 96% of the world's population. Only 7 countries did not complete the 2010 census round: Eritrea, Iraq, Lebanon, Pakistan, Somalia, Uzbekistan, and Western Sahara, related to economic and political issues varying from each one of these countries. And then now focusing a little bit on the American Census, and I got this information about the American Census outside of the textbook. So I include here a series of different websites, and most of them here, like these are all websites from the Census Bureau, the US Census Bureau, census.gov, which is the agency responsible, the bureau responsible to collect the census in the US. So the 1790 American Census, assistant marshals listed the name of each head of household and the number of persons in each household of the following descriptions. So they subdivided people in these 5 groups. Free white men of 16 years and upward to assess the country's industrial and military potential. Free white males under 16, free white females, all other free people, and slaves. So they pretty much collected data for all these people here in these categories. And that's the result of the census. So here you have the free white males of 16 years and higher, including heads of families. And these are the different states. And free white male under 16, free white females, and all other free persons and slaves, and counting 3.4 million people around that. Oh, just a parenthesis. In the last class, I draw in the slide that graph about the association between development and migration. And I said that I was going to add that slide into the lecture about theories of demography. But then I noticed that that slide is already included in the lecture about international migration. If you just check in the website the slides for international migration, that slide about the association between development and migration is available there. So this was the main result of the 1790 US Census, counting people and already breaking them down by some basic information of sex and race. The US decennial census had a short form and a long form questionnaires until the 2000 censuses. And that's an important thing to emphasize here. I said that the word census means that we are collecting information about all, or at least we aim to collect information about all inhabitants of a specific country in a specific year. So the idea is to get information about 100% people. Some countries might face issues, don't reach the 100%, but that's the ultimate goal. Here in the US and also in other countries, in Brazil is the same thing, you have a short form questionnaire. The short form questionnaire has really few questions, and it is intended to be asked, to implement it to all individuals in the American society. So this short form questionnaire capture pretty much this information here, the name of each one of the people that were residents in specific household, the sex of each one of these individuals, age, race, ethnicity, and ethnicity is pretty much if the person is Hispanic or not. You have subcategories of Hispanic, but that's pretty much what you're capturing. The relationship of each person with the head of the household. So am I the spouse of the head of the household? Am I the child, the father, the grandchild, and so on? And whether those people in that household own the house or they rent the house. So the short form questionnaire asks really few questions. Up to the 2000 census, here in the US, you also had the long form questionnaire. This long form questionnaire asks many more detailed questions, more questions about fertility, employment, so a lot of economic characteristics of people, and also migration. Migration, where the person was born, where each one of the members of that household were living exactly 5 years ago. But the long form questionnaire that were implemented up to the 2000 census, every 10 years, up to the 2000 census, although it's called a long form questionnaire that they were implemented in censuses, they were not implemented in all households in the US. So they were actually implemented to specific samples of the population. Right? So the long form questionnaire, usually they were implemented to only 5%, 1% of the households in the countries, up to the 2000 census. So although it's called the long form questionnaire of the census, that's actually not a census. It's not a full count of people. It was a sample of those people, not everybody, just a sample of people. But a sample of the people that would be representative to the whole population, right? So the idea is to select a specific group of people that are representative to the whole population so we can make inferences about the whole population, not just about that specific sample. So we have to follow statistical procedures to randomly select people so they are representative to everybody, to the whole country. But since the 2010 census, only the questions from the short form questionnaire are included in the questionnaire. The long form stopped being asked in the 2010 census. Now the long form questionnaire actually is part of the American Community Survey. And the American Community Survey is started in different states at different time, starting some states at the end of the 90s. But the American Community Survey that's representative to the whole country and it started being asked every year with the long questionnaire, in which is representative to the whole population of the US, started in 2005. So 2005, 6, 7, 8, and the latest one we have is for 2018. So this long form here is not asking the census anymore. For example, right now, the 2020 census that's going on, only the short form is being asked, and with the idea to capture information about the whole population. But the long form is part only of the American Community Survey. And one interesting thing, the 1940 census implemented the long form questionnaire to everybody in the US population. So the 1940 census, it's interesting because it did collect information about 100% of the people. So it's called the 100% count. The 1940 census did that. After the 1940 census, the long form questionnaire was implemented only to a sample of the population. The census questions are filled by one person in every household and covers every person in the household. Nowadays, what the Census Bureau does, they send the questionnaire by mail. You receive the questionnaire, and there is a code there, there is a link. If you don't want to answer in the paper, you can just go to that link and type the code and answer online, and the information is automatically transmitted to the Census Bureau. If you prefer, you can answer by paper, and then you send it for free back to the Census Bureau by mail. And if you don't answer, the Census Bureau keep trying to reach you, send again the form. And if you don't answer, someone knocks at your door and asks you to answer the questionnaire. And when the census day, the day that we ask the questions about place of residence, they are referred to in the census in the US, is April 1st. So it was exactly, we were already during the pandemic at that time, was right after the spring break. And then you might have received different emails from the university trying to tell you to answer the survey, answer the census, because if you don't answer the census, the population in College Station would be underestimated, and then in the future, like in the next years, it would receive less funding from the government, right? So that's why it's important to answer it. In some dorms here at the university, is the manager of the dorm that answers information about the people who live there. But if you rent a house, you live in an apartment here in College Station, you should be the person answering that questionnaire, right? So this is the example of the 2010 census with really simple, really quick information as the number of people that were living in that household. See, on April 1st, we asked this, all these questions are related to April 1st. That's the reference date. That's called the census day here in the US. Different countries have different census days. In the US, it's April 1st. In Brazil, it's July 31st. Yeah. Were there any additional people staying here in April 1st that you did not include in question 1? And then you can answer here. Is this house, apartment, or mobile home owned or rented or occupied? What's the phone number? The last name and the first name of the person responsible for the first person that you're going to collect information in this household. So you collect this information here about all people in this household. The first person, name, sex, age, and also date of birth, so you can check the information about age. Ethnicity, whether the person is Hispanic or not, and if it's Hispanic, like in specific subgroups. Race, and then you can combine the variables about race, ethnicity to create a variable race, ethnicity. That's the one that we have been using more here. Non-Hispanic white, non-Hispanic African American, non-Hispanic American Indians, and all the non-Hispanic Asians, and then Hispanic. In order to do that, you have to combine information from these two questions here. And whether the person sometimes lives or stay somewhere else. And this question is asked about for all people in that specific household, right? So just repeat the same questions here. One person answers the questionnaire. And now, like I said, these questions can be answered online, and that person answers the question about everybody in the household. There are two different kind of censuses, the de jure and the de facto census. This is related to how you will define whether the person lives in a specific area. The de jure censuses, which is the case of the US Census in Canada, for example, counts persons based on their usual, normal place of residence. Let's say that exactly on April 1st, I'm traveling for a conference. And when I receive the questionnaire afterwards, in the questionnaire we ask, oh, where were your residents on April 1st? My usual place of residence was here in College Station, not in the city of the conference where I was. So we have to answer the question for this specific census based on the de jure information on the usual normal place of residence. For students in College Station, a lot of you still have parents that live like in other places in Texas or outside Texas, and you go visit them a lot. And maybe exactly on April 1st, because of the pandemic, a lot of people were back home. It was exactly right after the university transferred all the classes to the online system in last spring. So a lot of these people might not have answered the census. That's why the university will say, hey, answer the census and tell the census that your usual place of residence is not where your parents live, the city where your parents live, but College Station. Because based on the size of the population of the cities, like I said, the federal government and even the state government provides some resources to the city, some benefits to the city. So in the US, people answer questions related to their place of residence on April 1st, called the Census Day. As I showed here in the questionnaire, it's always related to April 1st. The de facto counts persons based on their location on the day of the census. It doesn't matter if I'm in a conference on April 1st. If that day I was in a conference, I have to say that I was there in that city. It doesn't matter if I'm a student here at College Station and I was out just visiting my parents temporarily, but if I was my parents temporarily on April 1st, if the US Census was following this de facto system, then the person would answer that he or she lived in that city where the parents live. The de facto census are more common because they are cheaper. It's easier to ask questions exactly where the person is exactly on April 1st. And mostly in countries that have fewer resources and they don't send the questionnaire by mail or receive by the online system, by the internet, and you need people going to the households and asking the questions to the people who live there, it's easier for these people, to the enumerators, to go to these households exactly that day and ask who is living there exactly that day. It's cheaper to do it, but it's not measuring the usual normal place of residence. It's about where the person was exactly on the day of the census. And remember, the census day can be different for each country. So the de facto census are more common. And what's the justification to have census? So census is good for us to know about the size, composition, geographic distribution of the population, and help us implement some public policies in the country. It's good to understand data about crime, death rates, fertility rates, per capita income, migration flows, and so on. It's also good to the private sector. The private sector can also analyze public available data from the census to kind of look at the composition of specific markets where they want to implement new businesses, and see what's the composition of the population, which kind of services do you think they are requesting, they would request more based on their overall age composition, sex composition, education composition, income distribution, and so on. The census also allows us to estimate estimation of cohabiting household as well as same-sex households to tell us about current changes in how the society has been organized. In the US specifically, the principal reason justification for censuses is written in the US Constitution. It should provide population counts to be used for apportionment of the House of Representatives. So the idea is to count everybody in all the different localities in the US, and based on the size of the population on each one of these states, based on each one of the census, the number of representatives in the House of Representatives will be determined by the size of population from each one of these states. And there is a lot of recent debates with the current federal administration. They pushing saying that we should ask question about citizenship, because what the census is supposed to measure is question how many citizens we have. But that's not the reason that's detailed in the US Constitution. The US Constitution mentions that we need to know the overall population. And by the federal administration saying that we should add a question to that short questionnaire, to the short form. They're trying to add a question about citizenship to the short form. They were trying to do it in order to include whether the person is a citizen or not. If you include that question, it's really likely that the response rate will decline. And then the overall quality of the census would get worse. Finally, that was not allowed by the justice system here in the US, but just by the fact of having that public debate, a lot of people, of course, are afraid of answering the system. If they are not citizens, they are afraid of answering the census and be followed by the US government. But overall, we want to count people, know the size of the population in each one of these states, which will be used to update the number of House representatives by state in the US Capitol. The 2020 census is facing some issues right now. So this is a new slide that I just added here. And the quality and accuracy of the 2020 census might be compromised. So the Census Bureau has been experiencing delays because of the pandemic.
Is this testable?
Sorry?
Is this testable?
What do you mean?
Anything with 2020 census, is that testable or on the quiz or anything?
Yes. Okay. I was thinking that you were asking if this is testable to know whether the delays compromise the quality of the census. That's what I was understanding from your question. And the federal government decided to end the activities on the census earlier than expected. They want to end the activities by tomorrow, September 30th. And what a lot of people have been saying is that it could undercount vulnerable populations, usually minorities or people living in more faraway areas, rural areas. Those people could be undercounted and could compromise the quality and accuracy of the census. So the 2020 Census Deadline Extension Act that was introduced by Senators Schatz and Murkowski, what they tried to do is to require the Census Bureau to continue the field operations, not only until tomorrow, but extend it until October 31st. So the Census Bureau would have more time to collect and process data and have a more complete and accurate data count. Also extend the deadline to for the delivery of apportionment data to the US House of Representatives from December to April. and it extends the statutory delivery of redistricting data to states from March to July 2021. This redistricting data, it's another really important way that the census data is used. I mentioned to you, the population size by state, it's always used every 10 years to update the number of House representatives that each state will have in the US Capitol. And also the population within each state, within each congressional district, will tell how many representatives each one of the congressional districts will elect to the US House of Representatives. So this information here is the population by state, the size of the population by state. It's sent to the federal government, so define the number of representatives that you're going to have for each state. And this data here that is sent for each one of these states, it's more refined data. It's not information only for the state as a whole, but within the state, what's the population and composition of the population for each one of the congressional districts. And that will define how many state representatives will be elected based on each one of these congressional districts, state and also federal representatives, right? Because these congressional districts, they can change the boundaries based on the size of the population. And that issue here, that task here, is creating a lot of issues in the country, which is related to the issue of political gerrymandering. So what has been going on in the country in these last decades is that state legislators, they get this data here from the census about the population within the state to draw congressional districts boundaries to favor one specific political party. Gerrymandering is against the law unless you have topography in a specific, within a specific area, in a specific state, that gets into the way where the boundaries of a specific congressional district should be drawn. Districts are supposed to be contiguous regions. And this geographer from Sheffield University, Alasdair Ray, he built maps of all the 435 congressional districts back in 2016. And I got some of the maps that he generated to show how these congressional districts can be built in really complicated and weird ways, exactly in order to favor one political party. And that when you draw the maps based on racial, ethnic composition of the population, that is against the law. So one clear example happened in North Carolina. A Republican drawn legislative map packed African Americans and Hispanic voters into few congressional districts. So what happened? In 2010, before this new map was drawn, Democrats won popular vote, and they won 7 seats in the state house delegation, and Republicans won 6. So they won the popular vote, and they won more seats, 7-6. In 2012, after this new map was created in North Carolina, putting people, African American, Hispanic voters that usually vote more Democrats all together in a specific area, Democrats still won popular vote, but because the state representatives are selected within each congressional district, this gerrymandering map allowed Republicans to win 9 seats and Democrats won only 4. 7-6 in a switch, 9-4, but the popular vote, in both cases, Democrats still won. Just to show you the maps here. This is the map that has the congressional districts based on the size of the population within North Carolina, based on the 2000 census. So based on the 2000 census, these congressional districts were drawn. And up to 2010, that's the boundaries that they had here. So this one here, one Democrat state representative was elected. This one here was a Republican. This one was a Republican. And this weird shaped district here was a Democrat. This one a Democrat, and so on. This other weird shape here, Republican. In 2012, after Republicans changed the boundaries of the congressional district based on the 2010 census, look at that. The number of districts that elected Democrats dropped to only 4. So it's like 1, 2 here, 3, and 4, which is exactly what it said in the previous slide here. So look at this district. It still has the weird shape as this one before. But this other one, what has been said is that the Republican legislators, they put all African Americans and Hispanics that tend to vote more Democrats all together here. So they all elected just one representative, right? And although these areas that are highlighted here in red have fewer popular votes, they elected more representatives. So the same issue that we see with this popular vote and the electoral map in the federal election, we see within states, but that's really related to how the districts are created and with this issue of gerrymandering by House of the state legislators drawing these congressional districts in a way that benefit their own party. And that specific, the evolution of North Carolina 12th congressional district, that's that district, this one here. This district here changed the boundaries over time, and these are the different terms of the Congress, and the boundaries change over time, and it's now with this shape here, right? Which is exactly this area in blue here. And the idea of Republicans was, let's just put like all this population that tend to vote Democrat all together here. This could be big cities, but just put them all there and they will elect just one person, right? In 2016, North Carolina lawmakers were ordered by a US federal court to redraw 28 state House and Senate districts, exactly those districts that I just showed. The idea was the state's legislative map was considered unconstitutional by doing racial gerrymandering. But the Supreme Court in June 2019 said, hey, it's not the job of federal courts to decide about boundaries of states in relation to their congressional districts. But then a state court in September 19 ruled that the maps were unconstitutional parts, and they were doing parts on gerrymander, and other lawmakers should draw new maps. All right? So it's just to show the simple count of people, it's having the issues nationally, why the federal government doesn't want to count the population in a more accurate form as a whole. Exactly because minorities, all these groups that are more difficult to access and to reach, they tend to vote Democrats, and subcounting them will favor Republicans. This is the national. And within states, you have the issues of gerrymandering. In Texas, you also see some specific districts that have weird boundaries, but one discussion that's made as well is that maybe these areas here might be part of like a suburb of Houston, and those people might have similar socioeconomic characteristics and share some social networks, so it makes sense to have them together. So that's always a possibility as well. In Michigan, you have Flint and Detroit, which are usually bigger cities, and that tends to vote more Democrats. But they have only pretty much 2, 3 Democrats being elected. And these other areas here that probably have like smaller population than Detroit, they're electing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 representatives, right? So that issue happens all over the country. And the other thing that I really want to emphasize is the main reason of the census in the US, which is related to the House of Representatives. I will talk more about this in the chapter about race, ethnicity, and also about international migration, that the reason that the federal government says that they wanted to include the question about citizenship to that short questionnaire that has only these questions here, their argument is that the US Constitution actually requires us to know how many citizens we have, but that's not what the US Constitution regulates. It's asking about the full population. That's why it was not approved by the courts, right? But just, again, creating that discourse, that public debate, it compromises the quality of the data of the census because some specific groups might not be willing to answer the questionnaire because of fears of the federal government coming after them. Another important source of demographic data are the registration systems. The registration systems are collected in a continuous basis. It's pretty much the national list of persons with their names, addresses, dates of birth, and person identification number. The amount of variables, the amount of information, remember the database has the variables in the columns. The number of characteristics of variables, it's not as refined as census data has, or as the American Community Survey. But it's information that's collected on a continuous basis, and techniques collect information about everybody in that population. So these registration systems, they collect vital statistics. So it's data from civil registration, from birth certificates, from marriage certificates, from death certificates, and so on. And it's also from actual records of vital events. So all these different, so civil registration systems, so getting married, divorced, you collect data. You go to the local office, and that local office sends it to the federal government. And vital events such as birth and death, that information is also recording birth and death certificates. Around the world, in 2012, it's expected that based on UN data, 57 million babies were not registered. The percentage of children under age 5, 230 million were not registered, and 90% are registered in industrial, so the percentage of children under age 5 varies by more developed and developing countries. In more developed countries, more industrialized countries, around 90% of the children under age 5 are registered in some way in the country, usually by local agencies, and that information is sent to the federal government. In less developed countries, there is a lower percentage of children under age 5 that are registered with the government. For example, in sub-Saharan Africa, less than 20% are registered. Overall, in the world, 230 million children under age 5 were not registered. So some of them are 4 years old and they were never registered by the government. The same problem of accuracy of data you verify for mortality. Only 25% of the world population lives in countries with 90% or more of deaths registered, and usually exactly high-income countries. But only 25% of the world population lives in countries where at least 90% of the deaths are reported to the government. All the other 75% of the world population live in countries with you have really under enumeration of death. And I've shown that accuracy of death information is really low in several countries in the world. There are different authorities that collect information about vital registration. So vital records are responsibilities of the clergy in the 17th century England. And this practice was followed by the English colonies here in North America, in the US and Canada. And now here in the US, individual US states are the legal authorities to collect information about birth, death, marriage, and divorce. All US states had birth and death records on file by 1919. And each one of these states have then started having the birth and death records being counted. So by 1919, all US states had that. And these US states, these specific state agencies, they send the data of number of births and deaths to national agencies. And the national agencies were created in those years, the US registration areas. The death registration area in 1900, birth registration area in 1915, marriage 1957, and divorce 1958. So these are national agencies that collect information about death, birth, marriage, and divorce from all these state agencies. So birth and death data are sent by the states to the National Center for Health Statistics, who compiles data for the US. When babies are born in hospitals, someone from a state agency comes to the hospital and asks the parents to fill out information about the baby. Usually there is information about the name of the parents, education, age of the parents, of course, date that the babies were born and so on. And that paper at the hospital is given back to the employee, and the employee gives to the local authority, to the state, and then to the federal government. So by collecting that information direct at the hospital, you decrease issues of under-registering the number of babies being born. So that's the system that is usually followed in more developed countries. Birth certificates collect data on names and ages of parents, their occupations, and sometimes level of education. It varies a little bit by state. It's filled out by a physician, midwife, mother, or father. In my case, it was me. I fill out for my children when we were at the hospital. Because my wife was recovering, and then the woman from the local agency went there, gave me the two forms. I have twins, and then I fill out for each one of them. Death certificates collects data about the age of the person who just died, occupation, place of death, and cause of death. And it's completed by funeral homes with personal information about the descendant, provided by a surviving family member, physician, or a public officer or coroner. And whenever we are talking about birth and death and all this, what exactly is death? How do we know? How do we count that someone died? How do we know? How do we count that someone was born? There are some criteria that we have to follow in order to count the number of deaths and births in a specific country. And that's really important to understand these specific concepts and ways that we measure it, because otherwise we might get into a political debate and don't count deaths and births in an accurate way. So what are fetal deaths? The disappearance of life prior to live birth, which includes miscarriages, abortions, and stillbirths. And going to each one of those: miscarriage, abortions, and stillbirths. So miscarriage, abortion, stillbirths are types of fetal deaths. Miscarriage is the spontaneous or accidental termination of fetal life that occurs early in pregnancy. Abortions, premature expulsion of a fetus, is spontaneous or induced at a time before it is viable of sustaining life. Stillbirths, late fetal death of 20 to 28 weeks or more of gestation. This is really important to understand this. And again, these distinctions are commonly used in the US for political purposes. So we have to be careful if you want to do science, right? We have to know exactly what these terms mean. In the last presidential election, the current president said in a debate with Hillary Clinton that there were abortions being performed in the US at the time that the woman was supposed to have the birth. Abortions were being performed. The children were getting out of the woman's belly and the abortion was performed. That is completely wrong. That's not science. That's not scientific. If on the day of the delivery, medical doctors take the baby out of the belly of the woman and it's dead, it's not an abortion. It is more like a miscarriage. It's a stillbirth. It's a late fatal death that's not intentional that that death happened. So when you say that you had the cesarean section performed, so that's a C-section in which you had a stillbirth. The baby was not alive at the moment of birth. So that's not an abortion. That's a stillbirth, right? So you have to be careful when we go into these political debates that everything is so controversial now about everything, fertility, mortality, migration, that if you want to do a good argument, you have to be careful. You have, only if you care about science, right? Deaths, permanent disappearance of all evidence of life at any time after a live birth has taken place. So if a baby is born with life, and then afterwards that baby dies, that's a death. If at the moment of coming out, it's you have death, that's a stillbirth. And I don't even know if that example that was given at the presidential election was true or not, right? But it's not an abortion. Birth, extraction from its mother of a product of conception which breathes or show any evidence of life. After birth, some children might die. We all can die after we are born and then experience death, okay? But stillbirth is whenever you get out of the woman's body and it's dead, it's a stillbirth. But abortion is not what's going on in that specific example that was given in the previous election debate. So just to compare the censuses and vital registrations. The censuses are cross-sectional. Remember the Lexis diagram that we saw at the beginning of the course? We collect data for a specific year, for a specific population, for people in all different ages. And this data for that specific year crosses different cohorts. So it's cross-sectional, and that data allows us to estimate the size, composition, and distribution of the population. It is static because we usually collect that information throughout specific couple of months or throughout several months, but it's in a specific time period that the data collection is performed. The census, the authority here in the US is the federal government, and the residence is based on the de jure system. Registration systems collects demographic events, mainly births and deaths, but also can collect information about marriage and divorce, for example. It's dynamic and continuous because it's collected on a continuous basis. As people are being born and dying, they are reported to the state government, and the state government sends it to the federal government, also based on the de jure system. And there is a link here. This is the data for sources of demographic information. This is the lecture that we're seeing now. And this is a document by the UN in 2016 with information on countries by saying what's the system of their census, if it's a de jure or de facto basis. If you open this file, that's pretty much a PDF file. And if you are here on page 7, for each one of these countries, you have the information whether that country, and these publications from 2006, but usually these countries don't change the information of the system, how their census is collected. And here it says whether it's a de jure or de facto. De jure, the usual residence, and de facto, the residence where the person was at the time of the census. So you have African countries. You have a list here of all countries that you can check afterwards. And like we mentioned, Canada is de jure, and the US as well. Right here, de jure. Okay. And this publication is from 2006, so the latest available census in that case was the 2000 census, and the day of the census day in the US is April 1st. And see what it varies from each country. Oh, earlier today I said that the census day in Brazil is July 31st. I was wrong. It's actually August 1st, right? So one day later. So though the census day varies for each one of the countries, and also the style of the census, whether it's de facto or de jure. Cool. And the data from sorry, Arthur. Why we would do de facto census instead of de jure? Because de jure is more accurate, because measures where the person actually lives. Because de facto is cheaper. Right? De facto is cheaper, and some of these countries don't have the system that the US has to send the questionnaire by mail and have people answer by the internet. So they have to send people into the households with the questionnaire and ask the question. And so these countries that are less developed, they don't have the money to keep sending people over and over again until they find people in that household. So if they go that specific day in the household and the people are not there, they are not counted, right? And here in the US, because of everything's more organized, you have like the post office where you can send mail and then receive the information online. That system is so organized that it's okay to do de jure, and it's not so expensive to do anymore. But for these countries here, it's more expensive to do de jure because they would have to send the enumerators, the employees of the Census Bureau, directly to the household several times until they found the people there, right? So that's the reason. Thank you. So we are talking right now about census, that's the idea that we collect information about the whole population. And the registration systems, the idea is that we will collect information in a rolling basis, but the idea is that more developed countries, they collect data about all births or close to all births and deaths that happen in that population. The problem is that we don't usually have money to collect information about the whole population. We don't have money to collect information from all individuals in that specific country or in that specific state that I'm trying to analyze. So instead of collecting census that collects information about the whole population, I implement my questionnaire to a sample of that population. What is the sample of the population? It has to be a representative sample. The representative sample, I have to create a survey design that I will give similar chances of people to answer my questionnaire, and then I select some of them. Like I said, the American Community Survey, around 1% of the households answer the survey. In previous years, the census asked around 5% of the households. But the idea is that these households are so well selected in a randomly basis, following all the statistical procedures, that 1% or that 5% will be representative to the whole population, right? So social scientists need inferential statistics. They almost never have the resources or time to collect data for every case in the population. Expensive, takes too long time. We are doing now a research, I'm doing a research now with a professor from the School of Law, from the A&M School of Law, from another professor from the Bush School, and another professor from the Statistics Department. And we are trying to understand how the pandemic is affecting the restaurant industry. And we got the list of, there is a company here in the US that collects the list of restaurants throughout the US, like through online searches, through that big data machine learning process that I mentioned to you guys. And they have this list here. So we asked them, randomly select a specific number of restaurants from this list of all the restaurants in the US and send it to us with their contact information. So the statistician in our group asked them to send a specific number of restaurants, but randomly selected with the idea that that sample will be able to make generalizations about the population. So the average information that I will get from the sample will be generalized, representative to the whole population. Whenever we use information from samples that are randomly selected to make generalizations about populations, we are doing inferential statistics. But of course, we need proper techniques to make these generalizations based on samples to represent populations. So that's why we are working this interdisciplinary team who have the support of the statistician to define those techniques. So the idea is that we have a sample of people that are representative to the population, and based on, for example, the average number of workers of those restaurants that we interviewed by phone, we can have an idea of the average number of workers of all the restaurants in the US. So that's the idea that we are doing here. We are analyzing characteristics of the samples, indicators of the samples, and the indicators of the samples are called statistics. To have an idea of how are the characteristics of the population. The characteristics of the populations are parameters. Statistics are used to estimate parameters. So we use a sample that will give us a series of data. We estimate statistics, and if we follow the proper process to select those people in our sample, we will have a parameter that's representative to the whole population. A common kind of sample that we always hear during elections is exactly the election polls. The election polls, it interviews only hundreds or a few thousand of people and ask them which candidate they will vote. So we select a sample that's representative to the American population, and we ask them which candidates they will vote. So that's our statistic. The 30% of the people will vote to this candidate, 70% of the people will vote to that candidate. And we expect that this sample is representative to the population, so that statistic will be representative to my population parameter, right? In election polls, we can always say we have a final moment in which we see if the statistics was good enough because we have the election. And then we have the samples, and then after we have the election, we have the result of the census, of the whole population voting. The issue in the US is that because you have a lot of voter suppression, a lot of issues of people not voting, and from specific groups, it's harder to have samples that are representative to the whole population. So that's a huge issue for statisticians in the US to try to predict who actually will vote in the country. So surveys are required for the collection of more detailed data. Remember, the American Community Survey is the one that after the 2000 census started to collect the long form questionnaire in more than a regular basis since 2005. And it gets really detailed information about the population. So it's more detailed demographic information that's not contained on census and registration systems. There are extensive kinds of information available through sample surveys, and some of them are the ones that I'm going to list here. These are just some examples. Developing countries that usually don't have enough money to have their own censuses or census on a regular basis or household surveys like the American Community Survey. Some international institutions organize the demographic and health surveys. So these are surveys that are collected in developing countries since 1984, and a total of 260 sample surveys were already collected in 90 developing countries. And these surveys focus more on fertility, population, health, reproductive health, nutrition, and also mortality. There are interim surveys between the demographic and health surveys to kind of like just have overall information, not so detailed. It provides demographic information previously unknown about developing countries because they don't have as many data as developed countries. Gives a lot of information about fertility, contraceptive use, reproductive health, and mortality, and focusing also on child mortality. Some other surveys, famous surveys, the World Fertility Survey was coordinated between 1974 and 86. Also data on reproductive behavior and related social and psychological indicators in 62 countries. And these 62 countries represented around 40% of the world population. All the fertility surveys, they can focus on in a single country or community. The European Fertility Project collects data for European countries, and there are several family and reproductive behavioral surveys collected in other countries, like Puerto Rico and Mexico. And Mexico has many surveys being implemented. The federal government in Mexico started this family planning program at the end of the 70s to provide contraceptive methods to poor women in rural areas. So they collect a lot of like surveys to see if their policies their family planning programs are working, trying to see the reproductive behavior of their population. So Mexico has a lot of like surveys being collected in every couple of years. In the US, some of the examples of the most important surveys are the American Community Survey, collected every year, and it's the previous long form questionnaire of the census. The current population survey is collected every month and focus more on employment. So if you have seen those graphs about the employment rates dropping a lot in the country right after the pandemic, Usually that information is calculated using the current population survey. This information is, like I said, is collected every month, but they also provide an average for the year based on data from March. But they collect for the whole year, and then they provide the final result, and the reference date is in March. The National Survey of Family Growth and the National Longitudinal Study of Adolescent to Adult Health, these surveys here, they are longitudinal. So they follow the same group of people, the same sample of people throughout their lives, and ask the same questionnaire to the same people throughout their lives. So that allows us to do a longitudinal analysis of the cohort, as we discussed in the Lexis diagram. And because it follows the same people over time, we have panel data. The American Community Survey was redesigned from the census long-form questionnaire to be a continuous measurement survey in the late 1990s, but it started being more nationally representative since 2005, as I said, and it's conducted every year in all counties in the US. And we also have the Puerto Rican Community Survey, specifically for Puerto Rico. The purpose is to collect economic, demographic, and housing data, and we can compare it to the long-form questionnaire from census up to 2000, because they have similar questions. The sample communities with 65,000 and more population receive data estimates every year since 2006. Smaller communities, since it's harder, we have a smaller sample size, smaller interviews being conducted in those places, receive data each year based on 3-year estimates since 2008. 3 years estimates is that you collect data, you get the average of 3 years. So in this case here, these communities get, in 2008, they got data about their population based on data from 2006, 7, and 8. And you get the average. The sample is bigger because these are so small communities that you have to have a bigger sample. And then in 2009, they received another estimate that was based on the average of 2007, 8, and 9. And now the last one was based on 2016, 17, and 18. And even in smaller communities, they receive data based on 5-year estimates since 2010. So in 2010, they got data that was kind of like an average, a compilation of data that we put all together, data from 2006, 7, 8, 9, and 10. The ACS sample had around 3.5 million housing units addresses in 2013. And of course, that increases in more recent years. The current population survey, as I mentioned, is a monthly survey and is sponsored by both the Census Bureau and also by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And it focuses more on information on labor force, so more in the labor market, about the civilian non-institutional population. The sample is people with at least 14 years of age and older in around 60,000 households. So the survey, the sample size, the number of questionnaires implemented is much smaller than the American Community Survey. The ACS is 3.5 million households. The CPS, 60,000 households. But the interesting thing about the CPS is that it collects data every month. So it has information about the labor force and similar questions as the ACS, and in some years, some more supplementary questions as well. The National Survey of Family Growth, it's a sample of males and females respondents between the ages of 15 and 44, collect information more related to family life, marriage, divorce. And because it has more sensitive information about sexuality, these questions are implemented through a computer self-interviewing process. And also longitudinal, you can follow the same people over time. Same thing about the Ed Health, and sample of adolescents in grades 7 to 12, back in 1994 and 1995. And then they had 4 follow-up interviews with these adolescents that are now adults and going on throughout the decades, right? So you're following the same people, and these people that back in 1994 and 95 were in 7th to 12th grade. Good timing, 4:30. So I finish here this chapter, and in the next class, before I start the next chapter, I will just go through some websites that I list here at the bottom of our website. The websites for the pandemic, about the pandemic, I have already shown you, but I want to show you some websites from the Census Bureau and other sources where you can have a lot of information about demographic variables for everything: fertility, mortality, and migration. Okay? So
there's no quiz.
the quiz is open now.
Not here.
No? Did I not publish it? Oh, sorry. So I will just publish the quiz right now. Sorry about that. I will go to Canvas right now, and the quiz is going to be open until noon tomorrow. Thank you very much, and I see you guys on Thursday.